Buenas tardes. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I'm Dr. Carol Konzelman, and I am a teaching professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and I've worked in Bolivia since 1997. And my goal today is to talk to you about my research, and instead of going into sort of the political sphere, I thought I was going to move to Washington, D.C. and continue to study the impacts of the U.S. war on drugs in Latin America. I ended up staying in Colorado for a variety of reasons, and so I have transformed everything that I learned in Bolivia into the courses that I teach. And so I want to thank Wade Davis and Anthony Henman and Dennis McKenna and Andrew Weil. You've all been inspirations for me over the years. I'd also like to thank all of the people that I've worked with in Coroico, in the Yungas, in La Paz, in Bolivia, for teaching me so much and collaborating with me, as well as the Fulbright program for supporting my work. These are all my photos, just so you know. If you would like me to send them to you, or if you'd like to use any of them, just let me know. So my goal today, I have 3 parts, and the first is to focus on coca leaf. And the organizers thought that it would be helpful to show a little bit about the cultivation of coca leaf, which I've studied, as well as some of the origins of the US war on drugs. And I admit I've added some things just over the last couple of days, a little bit more background context into where drug prohibition came from and some of the impacts. And then the second part, I want to talk about this idea of participatory democracy and how Bolivian campesinos have organized into sindicatos, or labor union organizations in the agrarian area is my focus, and how they have used a variety of democratic methods to challenge systems of oppression, of domination, of exploitation, and advance more of a democratic kind of system in Bolivia. And then finally, tell you a little bit about what I've called critical drug pedagogy, which is just a fancy word for saying teaching young people and the public how to apply critical thinking methods to the issues that they're studying, and share with you a little bit about how I do that. And my ultimate objective here is to inspire conversation and innovation on how to educate people about coca leaf in order to shift public discourse and the legal landscape. So I'm talking about my research that took place primarily in 1997 until 2006. And I realized that a lot has happened since then. And I am choosing to focus on this time period because it really creates the foundation for what we're seeing today. And I don't pretend to be an expert on what is happening in Bolivia right now, but just know that a lot has changed in terms of the sindicato system has become more fractured in the Yungas and elsewhere. And coca the production has increased greatly, and I will allude to some of these things, but I really want to focus on the foundation for the trends that we're seeing today about the consolidation of indigenous political power and the challenges to the status quo of the US war on drugs and drug prohibition. So you can see here, I love this image, this satellite composite of the Andes range. And you can see, I don't have a pointer here, but you all know where the Yungas is on the eastern slope of the Andes, which is where I focused in the department of La Paz. And the region of the Yungas under the old Ley 1008, which was the law that was influenced by the United States in 1988, Bolivia's drug control law, the Yungas was declared the traditional zone, the legal zone. And the Chapare that was more recent, 1970s, 80s, and 90s, really responding to a lot of the demand for cocaine in the United States and elsewhere, was considered the illegal zone. And so a lot of the publications and research that was done on coca production and the sindicatos was focused in the Chapare. And so I decided to focus in the Yungas and see what was going on in the legal production area. And so you can see it's more of a highland area of Bolivia. Now, one of the unique things about the anthropological perspective is that it allows us to understand multiple dimensions of a culture, of a political system, of an area of the world, and so beyond what's just simply observable. And so what we know about the value of coca leaf, it is the linchpin of indigenous lifeways, as Alison Spedding put it. Of course, it has nutritional value for people's health. It has medicinal value. It has its value for labor as a mild stimulant. It has social value, especially in the system of Aini, or reciprocity. It's a symbol of social unity and connection. It has cultural value as connecting to ancient indigenous identity. Spiritual value, we know that its ceremonies in the Andes can't be carried out without coca. Has economic value, both in now a legal market, but also a system called trueque, which is an ancient system of exchange. And coca, before the Spanish arrived, was one of the most valuable entities that was used for trueque, that has been re-legalized by Evo Morales. It has political value as a representation for legitimacy in the political sphere. Agricultural value, coca is a component of a semi-diversified rural economy. A diversified semi-subsistence rural economy. And it has environmental value because traditionally it did not require chemical applications, and it led to the sustainability of the rural communities. Now, when I got home after spending a year and a half living in the Yungas for the bulk of my dissertation research, my ethnographic research, I was trying to understand all the different dimensions of coca. And this is just, I don't expect you to read all of these words, but some of the presenters have just talked about all the different dimensions. And this is an interesting thing. This means that as addressing coca leaf today, as we are in this conference, we can come at it from any angle. And it requires the integration of many different ways of knowing. So La Paz is one of the highest capital city in the world. And the mountains there in Aymara are called Achachilas instead of Apus, as they're referred to in Peru. And you can see there's a flat-topped mountain there called Mururata to the left. Illimani is there to the right. That's the main Achachila over La Paz. But if you go up and over from Miraflores to the Cumbre and you drop down the other side, you're looking back on Mururata from the other side and you're in the Yungas. And the Yungas is tropical forest up to about 11,000 feet. And it's deep and steep valleys because these are volcanic rocks here. Now, there are a lot of different ways to get to the Yungas. Now, there are Inca roads, of course, that were incredible feats of engineering that paved what were traditionally footpaths, ancient footpaths. And so you can hike down the Choro Trail. It takes about 3 days, which I did one day with my brother there. Or you can go on El Camino de la Muerte, which is, local people they hate that term. It's very sensationalized. They just call it El Camino Antiguo. But it's called the Death Road, and it was built in the 1930s by Paraguayan prisoners of war and Chinese laborers. And you can see the river way down at the left there. So you can see why it's called the Death Road. On average, when it was in full use until about 2006 or 7, about one vehicle every 2 weeks would go over the edge. It's now a tourist attraction where you can ride bikes down it. There's lots of companies that will take you. Now there's a brand new highway, which local drivers don't really like. It's boring, they say, and uses more gas. It takes a little bit longer, but it is safer. And when you get there, you're looking back up toward the Andean Cordillera, and it's a stunning area to spend some time. That was just the view from my house. Now, when I teach a course on the Andes, I like to emphasize the unique geographical orientation of the Andes mountain range, because it's actually very narrow, but there are over 20 different climate zones that are represented there, which is one of the reasons why Andean people really developed these complex societies there over many millennia. And so, as you can see, not very well, but the Ayu was an innovative system that was developed to facilitate the inter-exchange, not through markets, but through kinship groups of all of the different products that are grown throughout these climate zones. And so you can see that coca leaf in the Yungas on the eastern slope of the Andes, heading down to the Amazon, was just a component of this larger system of exchange in what John Mura called vertical archipelago. Now, the Ayu system was destroyed in terms of the kinship groups and all the different systems of exchange when the Spanish arrived. But as I will argue, a lot of the philosophy and the methodology of building community around the principles of the Ayu continues. So in the Yungas, this was a major area where the Spanish established the feudal system of the haciendas, which persisted for 300 years, and they took the best land that had been cultivated by the Aymara people especially. And then in 1952, Bolivia had one of the few successful revolutions and took their land back and established communities about for every hacienda that existed. And in the Yungas area, it's primarily Aymara people, but also Afrodescendientes, people who were brought over, enslaved from Africa, and then have created a lot of their own endogamous communities, and really a unique part of the Yungas region. Now, one of the other things that the Spanish brought were citrus. So this is a major part of the economy in the region, as is coffee, especially specialty coffee that has been cultivated for export. Tourism is a major source of income revenue for the region, as you can imagine, with such a beautiful area. Primarily Bolivian tourists, by the way. But about 2/3 of Bolivia's economy is still informal. So people selling goods, spices, or sandwiches to make a few dollars a day to cover their basic expenses. And so coca remains really the cornerstone of traditional Aymara culture in the rural economy of the Yungas of La Paz. So these chacras, or fields, have been cultivated for probably at least 1,000 years. We definitely need more research in this area. And these are now divided up and are owned by families that live in the small communities that you can kind of see along the hillside there. Now, one of the issues that I'm just raising here in this conversation is that the production of coca is really exploding. Now, this was even 20 years ago, so it's gotten actually worse. But I just want to highlight this idea, because coca is such a strong component of the economy, that people are colonizing new areas of the Yungas, both in the highland area and in the lowland. And it's causing the destruction of old growth forest and the contamination of water, because there is not very controlled use of chemicals, both pesticides and herbicides, that are sprayed somewhat indiscriminately. And so one of my questions or concerns is, would industrialization of coca actually lead to higher production rates and thus more ecosystem damage? And how much would it divert from the illegal market? So these are ongoing questions, as some of you all have raised as well. Now, traditionally, coca used to provide full employment in the Yungas with a gender division of labor. And men do still clear most of the land and build the Andenes. I got to work with this group of men one day, and my hands were covered in blisters by the end of the day. Women and youth still harvest most of the coca leaf, Though what has been happening more and more over the past 20 or 30 years is the use of aini, or reciprocity, is decreasing as the reliance on paid day laborers, usually people from the outside coming to take advantage of this strong economy in the Yungas, is increasing. So this is shifting the culture in remarkable ways. So when you have picked coca during the day, then the owner of that particular chakra will collect the coca and put them in these larger bags. And one of the unique things that makes coca so important for this particularly mountainous area is that a woman can carry the day's harvest on her back. You don't need to have a truck and roads, as you do for citrus, right? I mean, to get it to the legal market, you do need to have trucks, but you can put it on a bus if you want to. Now, once the coca has been harvested, then it just requires a few hours drying in the sun on something called a kachi, which is a slate patio. This particular house has its own kachi, which is pretty extraordinary and not necessarily common, although you'll see it around. But oftentimes people will just be opportunistic. When the clouds clear, you throw out a piece of plastic and dry it in the sun for maybe 3 or 4 hours. And then also, in some towns where there were haciendas, the campesinos have appropriated the massive cachis that existed in the haciendas, and they divide them up so you can rent them for a half a day and use those to dry the coca. But this gives a sense of the scale of the exploitation that existed during the hacienda era, where people had to bring the coca to the hacienda, and the hacendados would, of course, enjoy the profits from that. Then what's a unique aspect here, and I think this is actually significant, is that there is a licensed position in Bolivia called intermediario, or detallistas. And these are licensed middlemen that buy coca in bulk from the farmers and then are legally allowed to take it to the legal market in La Paz and sell it, or buy it from the legal market in La Paz and take it to shop owners or whatever. Now this, what I think is one of the major weak links in this chain. It's really hard to control how many detallistas there are, where they're actually buying coca from, and where they're actually selling it to. They may legally be buying it from the farmers, but are they actually taking it to the legal market, or up in the highlands, up in La Paz, or are they taking it down maybe more into the Amazon and selling it into the illegal market? So it's very difficult to control this. And it costs, well, it used to cost about $1,000 to get a detallista license. And so the government wasn't very interested in turning people away who had that money to spend. So this continues to be a little bit of a challenge. But if you get to Adepcoca, the legal market in La Paz, now there is a parallel market that Morales has set up, so there's some controversy there. But the coca is packed into takis, or 50-pound sacks, the regulation size. And there are different grades of quality of coca as well that they're divided into. But once you have them into the takis and everything is registered and you have to have licenses and everything, you can load it up and take it around the country, and it is easily accessible. It's legal in the country. It's very common. A lot of people use it, not just indigenous people, but truck drivers and market vendors and academics and lots of people. And so you can buy it on the side of the road there. And it's used, of course, in agricultural labor. There's little Weimar bringing the bags of coca from the carpa as we sit under the tree one morning. Of course, it's used in the mines, in Potosi especially, but also Oruro and elsewhere. That's also an indicator. If you have not been to Potosi or some of the mines, you can have a little bit of an insight of what it was like during the Spanish colonial era, when people were made to live inside the mines for 3 to 6 months, and understanding why coca was critical for their survival, but also facilitated their exploitation. If you go to any kind of meeting, any community meeting, you're gonna find a bag of coca and cigarettes being passed around that people will share, and this is part of its social value. People recognize that coca is a symbol of being a member of a community. And so this was a sindicato meeting that I went to in a town called Kilo Kilo. And you can see all the invited. There's the mayor and the sub-governor and my friend Sabino, who is the dirigente of the Central in Coroico, and then the other town council members and engineers as well. And the guy sitting at the table is taking notes. So this is a form of community democracy, very similar to like the Greek polis, except women are allowed. But it's people spend all day sharing their ideas, and they say una palabra, and then the guy takes notes, and at the end they come up with a conclusion, a path forward. And so coca is integral to this process. Also, of course, as we've learned, coca is critical for ceremonial uses, such as on the Aymara New Year, the June solstice. We make offerings to Pachamama. And Don Agustin there, may he rest in peace, used to do the leídos de coca. And no one, unfortunately, when he passed away a few years ago, had trained with him and is carrying that on. So a couple of things about just the origins of prohibition. How did something that was so integral to the social and cultural and economic and political and spiritual system that people had for thousands of years, how did it become so demonized? It went from the sacred leaf to the vilified leaf. Now, we already know this. The Spanish targeted it for eradication because they saw that it formed a bond among the natives that was an important obstacle to the spread of Christianity. But once the Spanish recognized coca's value, they took over its cultivation and trade, especially to the silver mines of Potosi. Now, this next point is important. Their elite descendants formed a powerful coca lobby called the Sociedad de Propietarios de Yungas, or the SPI, until Bolivia's revolution of 1952 and the agrarian reform of 1953. Now, they were in communication with the League of Nations in the early part of the 20th century and made sure that coca did not get caught up in the prohibitionist trends that were going on then. They're, oh, no, coca's fine. It's part of our economy. It's part of our culture. Don't bother us. And they didn't until indigenous people regained control of their territory. Then it became a legitimate target for eradication. And I don't know if anyone's done research on that specifically. I would love to see it. Now, Wade also mentioned this point from his book, One River, that and other people as well, this sort of fake science going on in the 1940s and 50s that targeted the use of coca, illiteracy, and a negative attitude towards superior culture were all closely related. So these were not racial democracies. Bolivia and Peru and elsewhere that were signing the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. And so there was no critical thinking, no historical analysis going on here. This was purely an ideological kind of feat. And as a result of that, because 100% of coca was supposed to be eradicated then in 25 years, then there proceeded all kinds of propaganda. And so I'm trying to choose some things that I'm guessing you guys haven't seen yet. But this is a book from Life magazine published in 1962 that identifies coca as the cause, they call it addiction to cocaine, as the cause of a man like this miner who was a lead miner, the cause of his death, the cause of the short lifespan, saying, you know, Andean people only live to about 40, and that coca was the cause of that, not this kind of backbreaking labor in a lead mine. As well, this is from a journalist named Dan Buck, who I met in Washington, D.C., and this was a copy of a poster that he collected from 1974 around Lake Titicaca that is trying to convince all of the native people from that area to not chew coca. That again, look at the Inca period, and I show this to my students, and I say, okay, what was life like there during the Inca period when they supposedly didn't have coca? Oh, well, they're productive, and they're weaving and planting and all of that, and living just a peaceful life. And then what happens when you have coca, the lower left there? Oh, well, all of a sudden, you're lazy, nobody's working, that family's clearly homeless, dressed in rags, and there's not even leaves on the tree or the sun in the sky. And they lived, those who chew, it literally says, those who chew coca live sad and poor. But what could happen if you get rid of coca once again, the lower right? Wow, magically you're going to have modernization and paved roads and that's right. The woman gets a nice little haircut and, So this kind of propaganda has continued until the election of Evo Morales. So this was in 2003, 2004. There were military checkpoints in the Yungas to make sure people weren't carrying the precursor chemicals and make sure everyone had a license. But even that photo on the lower right it wasn't at a bus stop. You would just fly by it and see these scary images and a lot of legalese there that, you would have to stand there and squint out to read anyway. So a lot of intimidation. And of course, this inspired a lot of resentment toward the US government. And so on the left, we see La Embajada in La Paz. And on the right, this was a bus that went through the Yungas on a regular basis. And people were very careful to say to me, we're not against people from the United States, just the government, of course. And this was pretty soon after 9/11. And mostly people were very concerned about what had happened during 9/11 and wanted to know if everyone was okay. But I thought this was interesting, this kind of imagery here, really connecting back to other kinds of Latin American heroes. So I just want to quickly point some of this out, that there is a long history of institutionalized racism in the United States that has led to this kind of prohibitionist mindset. And so it's not just in Latin America that these policies have affected people who have been marginalized for their cultural practices. Of course, Native American people in the US, Chinese immigrants for opium, African Americans for cocaine and later crack, and of course Mexican immigrants for the use of marijuana, supposedly. And so Michelle Alexander, if you're interested in this, she wrote a book called The New Jim Crow that's fantastic. But she argues very convincingly that drug prohibition is just a method of racialized social control. And that's what we can see not just in Latin America, but also in the United States. So a lot of propaganda as well, trying to scare the public and into demonizing certain groups of people of color that could be targeted by prohibitionist policies. What's interesting too is that the United States learned the lesson of prohibition with alcohol prohibition in the 1920s. We saw the same outcomes from alcohol prohibition that we see with drug prohibition. So, why are we continuing? I also want to just point out that Harry Anslinger, who was the father of prohibition after alcohol prohibition, he was the first director of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, spread mass propaganda about marijuana in the 1930s to lead to its criminalization. But he also wrote the draft of the 1961 UN Single Convention based on this kind of ideology, this prohibitionist ideology. And you can see there these kinds of statements that he was making about the threats to, polite white society. As well, I want to make sure this is in our conversation, the origin of the war on drugs. So to be clear, drug prohibition started in the late 1800s. The war on drugs was just another stage in prohibition. And Richard Nixon made this John Ehrlichman made this statement reflecting the attitude of Richard Nixon. And so he says, I'm just going to read it. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. Don't forget that the civil rights movement had just been successful in the 1960s, leading to voting rights for African Americans. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and psychedelics, and African Americans with heroin and cocaine, and then criminalizing those drugs heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. You guys probably know about the Dark Alliance, Gary Webb's reporting that exposed the link between the cocaine trade and the CIA. Michael Levine wrote The Big White Lie about his work as a DEA undercover agent in the 1970s and 80s in Bolivia and Argentina. Absolutely mind-blowing. I highly recommend. Just Google search Michael Levine, all kinds of interviews. You'll go down a rabbit hole. So here's the thing. As Gabor Mate says, the war on drugs is not a failure. It is actually working exactly as designed. And that's what we have to recognize. So who is benefiting from the drug war? This is where power lies, and this is where we can focus our analysis. Yes, it's been catastrophic. It has caused all kinds of harm to society, to indigenous cultures. It has created violence in all kinds of communities in the US and in Latin America. There's public health risks of consuming unregulated drugs that include the fentanyl overdose crisis. There are massive profits going to the prison military industrial complex and big pharma, suppression of academic and medical research, and no net reduction of drug consumption or addiction rates. So what are we doing here? It's time to change. And so these kinds of lessons, people who are subjected to US foreign policy know very well what it's all about. And they understand very much more than people in the United States do about what our policies are, how the impacts that we're having. And so what I really find fascinating about Bolivia is its ancient traditions of indigenous popular participation in public life, even though they were excluded from official institutions for most of its history. They have a sense of engagement and from the Ayu tradition, which was transformed into sindicalismo in the early 1900s. So these are just some examples of some marches and protests in La Paz, as well as in Cochabamba. There are, on a weekly basis, there are several different manifestaciones, as well as different strikes. In 2003, I was in Cochabamba for the gas war, which was really interesting, really fascinating to see all the protests that led to first demanding dialogue with Goni and then demanding that he resign because he decided to send the military against peaceful protesters. And so this was what occasioned Carlos Mesa to become president as a constitutional succession. And so what I learned from that experience was the different discourse that was going on in the media and coming out of the US Embassy at this time. They were saying, look at these people in the streets. They're disrupting the system. They don't believe in democracy. They're anti-democratic. They just want to get rid of the Constitution. And you go in the street and hear people and they would say, no, 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 this is what democracy looks like. We are the ones practicing democracy. So that set up my inquiry for the year. And so I attended, I think in 1 year, 135 different meetings, including in, among other things, but just meetings. This was in the mayor's office, in rural schools where the city council members would go to meet with people directly. This was in the Civic Center of Coroico, discussing the first referendum on natural gas. And again, like Aymara, people are like, oh, this is the first referendum, whatever. We've been doing referenda for thousands of years. This, again, that meeting in a rural community, and then sometimes they would have a provincial meeting with all of the Secretario Generales of the communities of the sindicatos would come together. And you can see the slogan on the bottom of that sign, and it says, Coca or muerte venceremos. And so I learned very quickly that coca was the center of the main inspiration for bringing people together to organize democratically to defend coca. And so there were marches and rallies in the city, and they would always reference back to Tupac Katari and Bartolina Sisa. Tupac Katari and Bartolina Sisa were the main leaders of a massive effort to expel the Spanish in the late 1700s. This is a mural in Radio Yungas in Chulumani, and there's a lot of symbolism there. And so another method was the bloqueos. And so you could see, I had looked back at my notes for preparing this presentation, and Sabino is standing there and he's saying, Hayaya Tupac Katari, Hayaya la Coca. And so people are still using that as their main kind of touchstone. As Gabriel Carranza, who's a lawyer in Bolivia, wrote there that it represents the continued struggle. And so the way that the cocaleros framed their struggle was around coca sí, cocaína no. And I agree that this is sort of a false dichotomy, but I think it allowed them to legitimize the struggle in this case to try to protect La Hoja Milenaria. And it became part of that's Dionisio Núñez, his campaign for diputado. And I hate to say it, but there was a Coca Summit, a Cumbre de la Coca already. But 2004, the ADEP Coca organized Cumbre de la Coca in the law school of the UMSA. And they had people from all different sectors for 2 days. This is what they do well. The sindicatos do well, is they divide people up into discussion groups around like 16 different topics to figure out how are we going to address this? What are we going to do? They're framing the issue around, how do we protect ourselves from the transnational corporations that just would rather take over the production and a market for coca just like the Spanish did. And so what are we going to do? We have to build an international strategy, a coalition between NGOs and research bodies and experts and elected officials and all kinds of things like that. They also, another method that they used was something they called a coca fair. And they called it the Campaña de Coca y Soberanía. And I love this quote, again, from 2004. It says, now that we have completed 1 year of the struggle for natural gas and national dignity, that was the gas war that they were able to derrotar the traditional political parties, we want to recognize the unity, strength, and clarity that the grassroots organizations showed to incite this heroic struggle, always in the company of Akuyiku. El Akuyiku, or chewing coca together, is a force for culture, politics, and identity that we have to bring to light and defend, just like was done and is being done with gas, land, and water. It is time not only to celebrate coca leaf, but also to create a much broader struggle for sovereignty integral to our land and territory. And so this was at the Coca Fair. They had all these different booths and exhibits. They had a booth for every single region of the Yungas to talk about their coca, as well as the woman on the right wrote a cookbook for how you can cook with coca flour. And of course, a lot of scholars, notably Silvia Rivera, Cusicanqui, and Alison Spedding, who've spent their entire professional lives studying coca, publishing, speaking. They should really be here as well. And then, of course, regular old elections are also a major democratic method of engagement, of transforming the system that people are living in. And so in 2004, at the end of the year, were the municipal elections. And this was really the first demonstration of the rise of political indigenous power. And so this then, the next year, led to the election of Evo Morales. He was inaugurated as the head indigenous leader in Tiwanaku, the first ceremony that had taken place there in 500 years. And then the next day was inaugurated as president in the Congress. And he really occasioned, in the early years, some significant transformations. And some of the symbols were that they started flying the Huipala on the Parliament building, which blew me away when I went back after he had been president, as well as some portraits of indigenous leaders, including Tupac Katari and Bartolina Sisa. On the presidential palace, they defaced those old military checkpoint signs. And of course, as we've learned, implemented what has been a relatively successful effort to eliminate the violence associated with coca control and control of the drug trade, called community control policy, or control social. So I won't go into a lot of depth. That was in Chapare. Now the Yungas, I should say, cocaleros, were not really happy about that because they're used to operating autonomously as the legal zone, the traditional zone. Don't tell us to limit to the Cato, right? Like, don't measure our fields, because they're really not really wanting to be part of the state in that way. I just wanted to throw this in here as well. There is some movement internationally to at least have this conversation from The Economist, even, to say that, maybe it's time to legalize cocaine, really just recognizing that prohibition, the only reason that cartels exist is because of prohibition. And so programs like Narcos or something like that is so silly, because they don't really address the actual root cause of the violence we have in our society, of the underground economy. And so this statement I wanna read because it's important. It's from 1981. The indigenous person is the protagonist of his own destiny. It is necessary to put forth that the liberation of indigenous populations should be accomplished by themselves, or it is not liberation. When outside forces try to represent them or take leadership of the liberation struggle, there is created a form of colonialism that expropriates the indigenous populations of the inalienable right to be protagonists of their own struggle. We affirm the right of indigenous people to experiment with their own schemes of self-government, without these experiments having to adapt and imitate the economic and socio-political schemes that predominate in a particular moment, such as neoliberalism. The transformation of the national society is impossible if there's no feeling from the indigenous person that the creation of his own destiny is in his hands. And this was a statement from Sesut Sebe in 1981, that Bolivia was coming out of the era of the military dictatorships, and they were trying to set the stage for their own kind of conception of what participatory democracy actually meant. And this was a piece of graffiti that I walked by every day in Coroico, the basically long live self-determination. And to me, that's really at the core of what democracy means. And finally, quickly, I want to just show you a few examples of how I've transformed this kind of knowledge into educational opportunities for both undergraduate students and the public. And so I teach courses on drug policy, and I also run workshops at the International Drug Policy Reform Conference, which happens every other year, organized by the Drug Policy Alliance. And so I've introduced this idea of, okay, we're all learning all of this amazing stuff, but how are we going to teach people? How do we educate the public? How do we identify who our audience is? So I've brought together experts to have this kind of discussion. One of my collaborations from the reason why I'm work in the Yungas is because I went to the Unidad Académica Campesina in Carmen Pampa, which was the first rural college in Bolivia serving indigenous youth. And so I went there in 1997. I was invited to go there as a teacher, as an international development worker, and had this conversation, and I've stayed engaged as a form of reciprocity, as my own form of Aini, ever since. And when I decided to create a study abroad program at the University of Colorado, if I couldn't go and do my own research because I'm a full-time teacher, and it's one thing to teach about these issues in the classroom, but to bring young people to Bolivia to learn from themselves is a form of experiential education that I think is just the best way to learn. And so we would go to the university and learn from the students there. I had my students collaborate with the Bolivian undergraduate students on their thesis projects the Bolivian students' thesis projects. We had guest speakers. We hiked up to the top of the mountain to celebrate Pachamama on the New Year. We would visit Afro-Bolivian communities, learn from them. We would go on the radio. I would say, hey, here we are. You know, the community radio is one of the best places to learn and connect. And I would say, okay, if you see a bunch of gringuitos walking around, this is what we're doing. Of course, picking coca, going to museums, picking coffee, learning from farmers, doing lots of hikes in the fresh air and up in the old growth forest on top of Uchumachi, and even participating in the Dia del Campesino parade with my friend who had started a program called Coca Tours. And so the last thing that I want to just highlight here is a connection that I made during my fieldwork. Yes, that's me 20 years ago. Don Ignacio Caizay Quispe was the first sindicato leader after the revolution and agrarian reform in the 1950s that finally allowed the establishment of elementary and high schools for indigenous youth. There was one, in 1952, there was one elementary school in the rural area. And then, so he established the first one there in this town called Cruz Loma. That's his house there. And when I brought my first group of study abroad students in 2012, he asked me to come over and meet with him. And he presented to me this book that he wrote. And that's the cover page. And it's called Historia de la Coca. And I consider it a people's history in the Howard Zinn tradition. And it was 75 pages, front and back, edge to edge, and it's the entire history. And in fact, I have it here. I'll pass it around. And I presented it to David Choquehuanca, Honorable, this morning. And because it's the 200-year anniversary of Bolivia's independence this year, we're going to collaborate on something. And I have ideas like about how I want to make a book or something. But, you know, more immediately, I want this to get out. I did make copies. And he just asked me to type it up, have it in electronic version, and then please do with it what I wanted. And so, of course, what I want to do is make sure that his voice gets out there. I've worked with Juan Angola Maconde, who's an ethnographic economist and Afro-Bolivian historian in the Yungas, and we've collaborated on this. And there's my first group meeting him. Unfortunately, he passed away before he could see this final copy. But so again, if you all are interested in this document, please let me know. Finally, in terms of how I teach about drugs across the board, is I follow Andrew Weil's lead, where he says, look, all drugs are dangerous, but drugs are here to stay. They have always been part of human culture and society. So drugs themselves aren't good or bad. It's the relationship that we have with them. And so we each have to be really honest with ourselves about what the impact is, how we're able to use it, what's our knowledge, the set and setting, right? And along those lines at CU Boulder, when cannabis was legalized in 2014 for recreational use, I decided to create something called the Cannabis and Psychedelic Symposium, and I ran it for 11 years. And Dennis McKenna was our featured speaker a couple of years ago, as well as people like Dr. Bia Labache from Brazil. We've had all kinds of experts. Leonard Picard, who was jailed for producing LSD and freed during COVID. I've worked with student groups. I'm the faculty advisor for 3 different student groups: Cannabuffs, the Psychedelic Club, and Students for Sensible Drug Policy, and we collaborate on this event every year. Right now is a Pachacuti. We are in a time of change. We need to come together from all of our different areas of expertise. And I draw inspiration from ARAP Coca, the Bolivian Coca Producers Association. The statement they put out, Alberto Mamani was being interviewed about the first Coca Summit And he said, "It is our point of view that all these legalistic positions on the part of the UN, including the existing conventions, would be completely changed overnight if the international public opinion on coca leaf changed." And so I leave you with this slide that I look forward to talking with you about. But how can we educate the global community on the history, culture, science, and myriad uses of coca leaf in order to shift public opinion and thus the legal landscape? Who is your target audience? Each of you has a really unique focus, and I have 2 pages of a list already I've put together from your presentations, all the different ways you guys are already educating people. And then what innovative methods could you use? What are the challenges and limitations? And I look forward to continuing to trade ideas and building connections. It is a complete honor to be here with all of you. It's really a dream. So thank you.